I hear these words of Jesus from today's gospel lesson, and honestly, I just want to say, really? Really, Jesus? I feel like those disciples on the road to Emmaus. Haven't you heard? Where have you been, Jesus? Don't you know that more than 250,000 people have died from the coronavirus? And more than a quarter of them here in the United States. People die alone without their loved ones, without being able to say goodbye. And the healthcare workers who are taking care of them have to risk their lives because they don't have the equipment and the resources they need. Haven't you heard that more than 30 million people have lost their jobs? And the countless inequities between rich and poor and people of color are glaringly obvious yet again. We feel vulnerable and helpless. No one is safe. And there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. The predicted numbers just skyrocket. How can our hearts not be troubled? Our hearts are breaking. And yet, when Jesus spoke these words to his disciples, they were facing their own crisis. The crucifixion, the coming destruction of Jerusalem, their persecution as Jesus' followers. He knew what was coming. Jesus tells his disciples that he is the way. His way, the way we too try to walk as his followers, is one of compassion. The word compassion literally means to suffer with. To have compassion for others is to share their pain and suffering and sorrows with them. That was Jesus' way. Jesus came and entered into human life to share our troubles and trials. Jesus' way is to walk towards suffering and trouble. Our preference would be to run away from it. It seems that following Jesus involves a lot of turning around. When Jesus says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled," he isn't telling us not to hurt. He isn't telling us to bury our heads in the sand and ignore the grief and fear and pain all around us. Sheltering in place doesn't mean closing the door and shutting our eyes to the crisis that's facing our world. So you aren't alone, and it isn't a lack of faith if you're feeling troubled and worried. In fact, it's pretty Christ-like. Jesus himself was often troubled. He was moved with deep compassion for the crowds because he said they were like sheep without a shepherd. He was moved with compassion when he saw a widow whose only son had died, when a leper knelt begging at his feet, when a blind man cried out from the roadside for mercy, when he wept at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and when he wept over Jerusalem at the devastation he saw coming. When we follow Jesus and enter with him into the places of trouble in our world, we find Jesus' way through. We come to know by our own experience God's presence and faithfulness with us. Jesus' reassurance to us not to be troubled doesn't mean there isn't going to be trouble. He doesn't mean that we might not get sick, that we might not lose a loved one, that our livelihoods might not be affected, our plans might not get upended, and our futures may not be what we had expected. But he does mean that whatever comes, in the troubles and pandemics of our world and of human life, we are never, ever on our own. God is always with us, giving us the grace and mercy and strength and hope that we need. After Jesus tells his disciples not to let their hearts be troubled, he goes on and tells them to believe. Believe in God and believe in him. Now, as Renee often reminds us, that word believe doesn't mean to intellectually agree. Instead, it means to trust. Trust in God. Jesus is saying, trust in me. Well, in our era of fake news, it's pretty hard to know who to trust, isn't it? News about this pandemic has been a roller coaster, changing from day to day, expert to expert, news channel to news channel. Who do we trust? Who has credibility? Who has the truth? Philip, like Thomas, was skeptical. He wanted to see for himself. Just show us God and we'll be satisfied, he says. Jesus answers him, if you don't think my words of assurance are credible, then look at my works. Look at my life. I live the truth. I am the truth. Jesus' life was one of kindness and generosity, of always looking out for the weakest and most vulnerable, of raising up the poor and the suffering, even in the face of opposition. Jesus is credible. Jesus is trustworthy because of what he has done. Jesus also tells the disciples that he's preparing a place for them, a dwelling place. For Jesus, a dwelling place, the place we dwell or abide, isn't any physical structure. It isn't a mansion up in the sky somewhere. Rather, our dwelling place is a deep, intimate relationship with him. We can face and enter into the world's troubles with courage and with trust, because no matter what may come, we are enfolded in God's love, God's abiding love and relationship. In our reading from Acts today, Stephen was enfolded in that dwelling place. In the midst of trouble, as he was facing his own death, being stoned for following Jesus, he looked up into heaven and Jesus was there. Friends, Jesus is here. Jesus is our dwelling place. These are troubled times, but it is for these times that Jesus has come. Jesus' presence with us and Jesus' way of generosity and compassion will bring us through.